Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren,
ladies and gentlemen, guests, welcome to this evening's discussion. And first of all, a big thank you to you for having come in such numbers. Once again, I'm always surprised to see how many people can fit into this hall, how many people come to this hall to listen to discussions on what are not always easy subjects. A national study was published 1 year ago on youth and religion, and amongst other things, this study showed that 4 out of 5 young people believe in God or some kind of divine power or authority. However, very few of those young people asked want anything to do with the church. So they have faith, but they don't want to go to church. They don't want anything to do with church, putting it very simply. I think that's the basis for this discussion. There is a longing for meaning, for values, for spirituality in our society. As it's as rich as ever, perhaps even more prevalent than it was in the past today. But we're seeing that the churches are not speaking the same languages as these young people. So we're going to be discussing a number of questions today. For example, is it necessary for religious institutions to exist? What can churches do to meet this demand for meaning, values, and spirituality? And if we are to assume that the church is being called upon less to meet these desire for meaning, then what can the church actually do to counter that? So, on the podium, beginning from the right, we have Fazlun Khalid. He is the founder and director of the Islamic Foundation for Ecology and Environmental Sciences. And he is with us this evening. And that's in Birmingham, in Great Britain. We have Parhisi, who's a senior officer in the Ministry of Justice for Integration in Europe. She comes from Iran. She is a Muslim, but doesn't see herself here in a capacity as representative of her religion, but rather as an economist and legal expert. She has worked on women's rights in Iran and has also been working with the authorities in Afghanistan on education. On my right, we have Adrian Loretan. He is Professor for Law and Religion at the University of Lucerne. On my left, Gottfried Locher, the President of the Council of the Federation of Swiss Protestant Churches, and in that capacity, one of the hosts, I suppose, of the Open Forum. John Pult, he is the President of the Socialist Party of the Canton of Graubünden, and he is responsible for the ethics initiative in the Council of Graubünden, which called for the replacement of religious teaching through a neutrally religious education. We also have Locher, who is Professor, Department of Practical Theology and Religious Education at Humboldt University in Berlin. Allow me to put a very short personal question that I would not normally put on on such an occasion, but I think it's appropriate to this. I'd like to begin with you, Mr. Schieder, and put this question to all of you. Mr. Schieder, do you pray? Do you go to church? Yes, I pray regularly, and I only go to church if the quality is right. Well, we'll come to discuss that and what that actually means. Mr. Pult? I don't pray. Sometimes I go to churches if friends have important ceremonies, for example. Mr. Locher? I pray, not just as a part of my job, but also in the family, and I go to church as often as I can. You've been a priest, but you've been a parson, but when one is not a parson, one can also go to churches. It's quite good to see what everybody else is doing. I think that's called benchmarking. Mr. Loretan. I also pray, but that was a long search. For a while, it certainly didn't suit me at all. Yesterday, I had an interesting experience. I went to church, but I didn't understand the Mass at all because it was in Romansh. Well, I managed more or less to understand what was being said with my knowledge of French and Italian. I know the structure of Mass, so I was able to follow. But the symbolism was still very powerful. That in this small vision, Tithon Castle, the fact that the cemetery and the church were so close together was very interesting. The fact that the young and the old then went to the cemetery together was very interesting. Ms. Parhisi, I think religion is private. I'm happy that I live in Germany, where it can be private, but you have the opportunity of talking about it in public as well. Mr. Khalid, what about you?
I could complicate your question by asking me, what do you mean by prayer? But anyway, yes, as a Muslim, I do pray, and it takes a different form. You don't necessarily have to go to a mosque to pray. You can pray anywhere. I pray at home every day, 5 times a day.
But you go usually to a mosque?
It is not compulsory, but we go to a mosque on a Friday for the congregational prayer. But on a daily basis, we are required to pray 5 times a day, and we do that.
Okay. Ich habe in der Ausschreibung...
A book has come out, or a small bulletin on the open forum and on the individual issues. In one of the articles on the issue which we're discussing today, I found the following sentence. Churches are bulwarks against the excesses of society. Without inclusion in the church, faith becomes sterile. It is cut off, and believers become declamatory in their approach and even dangerous. I'd like to put that out there and ask the panelists whether that is right or whether it's not.
Ich meine, das ist ja eine der...
Well, that's one of the worst aspects of the churches. They think that if they can criticize culture, then they can benefit from that. I think the opposite is true. The more the church is part of the culture and contributes profitably to it, then it's better. Can't be seen as some kind of bulwark or force of resistance. In the United States, for example, the church marched together with the people in their search for freedom, and that's why people there are so religious. Yes, well, I also think the culture is carried by the church. I would say in Switzerland is part of society. It doesn't simply speak against things, it works with things, and I think that's done our country no end of good. Well, I would say the opposite. In France, the president has indicated that the churches, the religious communities, are an important element in bringing people together. They realize in France that if that goes away, then there's in a secular country, then there's no binding force to bring people together. That's what Sarkozy has said and recognized that. Although his policy in this area is something which has come under criticism. I don't know whether that's the right approach, and I obviously have full respect for the office of the President of France. Now, I don't profess any religion. I wouldn't take advice from the Church, but on this matter, I would say the sentence that you have read is problematic, because it says that the people are not free enough to decide what they want, and they have to be in some way part of a church community. So I would understand this sentence as something which supports the authoritarian role of the church, and therefore not democratic, and therefore wrong. Coming back to you, Mr. Schieder. In your texts, I found a sentence which isn't so far from the one that I've just read out. You've written somewhere that a culture which is not embedded in religion will find itself facing dangers. Oh, I did write that, but you need to give me a couple of minutes to explain what I mean. We live in a culture of individualism, where every one of us is expected to find our own path. And religious freedom is a precondition of that. The question is, how do I become an individual so that I can make the most of the opportunities of my society? There are many young people, neo-Nazis, for example, who say, I don't want to be an individual, I want to join some kind of group. That's why it's necessary to have institutions who educate people to become individuals. Now, the education issue is something which wasn't really outlined in the texts on this subject, which we saw in the bulletin. But it's necessary to educate people so that they know what the meaningful way for them to develop is, and so that they can also learn from their own mistakes. But without this possibility of learning from their mistakes, but finding their own path, either through agreement or contradiction, then it simply won't work. On this question of the need for a culture to be embedded in religion, when you look at how Islamic terrorism arises, you find that it doesn't arise in a culturally embedded form of Islam, which is in constant dialogue with academics, but rather it's people without cultural roots, people who have lost their sense of groundedness through their religion, and through their rage at that then become violent. Well, this contrast of individual thinking and the society is an interesting one. I belong to a church which says if you want to communicate values to another, then you can't simply go on your own path. And this open forum wouldn't take place without a church organization thinking that we need to come together and we always need to think for ourselves. Well, yes, that's true, says Mr. Poole. This open forum is a good thing. And speaking honestly, I think that the open forum is very good. I mean, I think that otherwise it wouldn't be accepted in Davos at all. Normally, I would have been on the street at this time of year instead of coming to the open forum. I'd have been protesting. So this is an excellent thing. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be churches, or that the church is something inherently bad, or that we don't need them, but I would be vehemently against a church coming and saying, you stupid people don't understand how to think, what to do, you have to come to us, we are the only wall of defense against a kind of situation without culture and civilization. So I would resist that. I mean, my values are Enlightenment values. I believe in human rights, and therefore I'm convinced that you always have to believe that an individual has the inherent capacity to decide for him or herself, regardless of whether he or she is part of a religious community. And every individual's decision is equally valid. I wouldn't say that we don't need the church or that it doesn't have any function. I think it's very good that here on the left-hand side we have two positions which go very well together. I agree with you. Paternalism in the church is awful, and the churches have a lot to do with that. Well, we can also find agreement on the right-hand side of the panel as well, with regard to what you were saying from a politician who promotes integration. I think that the position of the church is important. In the sentences that you've read out, as a secular Muslim, I can recognize what's being said. At the moment, the churches don't represent the majority of the population, but there are processes underway where other identities are at stake. Other identities are involved, and it's necessary to keep them in mind. Mr. Khalid, because you're so polite, you haven't said anything yet, and probably wanted to wait until everybody else had spoken. Or maybe you weren't saying anything because for you, it's difficult to imagine that faith and institution could exist so separately and not be interlinked.
Well, I've come here, haven't I? So I've got to respond to the questions. I could easily duck that question by saying I don't go to church. But I think what you're trying to find out here is there a connection between culture and faith? Do I get you correctly here? Do I read you correctly? You're trying to find out the commonality between culture and faith. Is that what you're trying to get at? Then I can answer. Okay, fine. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I'd like to tell you about Tony Blair. He was the Prime Minister for 8 years. He led people to war, and then soon as he stopped becoming Prime Minister, he became very religious, and he converted to Catholicism. There we are. So I think what he was trying to say was, when he was a politician, he was something else. Now he's not a politician. Now he's a person of faith, and he can go to church. That's his personal salvation. Well, I don't know how can I approach this, talking to a Christian, mainly Christian congregation. As a Muslim, I have to recognize that Islam is a worldwide faith, as you know, and there is, if you like, a cultural adaptation to Islam. And in that adaptation, there is also a universal commonality, because the institutions within Islam, in fact, bind the people together, in that there are 5 institutions, or if you the 5 pillars of Islam. So I think that faith or religion takes the best out of culture, distills culture. And I think if there was no Christianity, there wouldn't have been a Western culture, a culture as you know it. Because what faith and your religion, Christianity, gave you are moral parameters about relationship with each other. It's about relationship to the divine, and also relationship to each other as individuals, as parents, as children, as uncles and aunties, and so on and so on. And as people of community. I think what we are witnessing today is that because we now subscribe to a paradigm which is economic, we have distanced ourselves from the paradigm of the church or the mosque or the community. It is something else altogether. And now we are, I believe, in the throes of reinterpreting our connection between our churches and the mosques and our faith and our community. And I think this is what it's all about. And for this reason, I'm not really surprised, and this is the same also true in England. There are young people who believe but who do not owe any allegiance to an institution. I'm talking about the wider community. But in Islam, you see, there are the 5 pillars that draw you back inside. If for people who don't know what they are, the first one, in fact, pronounces an individuality which only an individual can affirm, which is to say, I believe. Very simply, that's what it is. In the Arabic, it's La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, meaning I believe that there is only one God and that Muhammad is his prophet. Now, so you see, in the Islamic model, you begin with an individualism that is always there. But then you see, it is also a fact in life that the human is also a group animal. If we are not a group animal, we would not have had a civilization. If we were not a group animal, we wouldn't have moved away from being hunter-gatherers. You see, so in order to motivate and keep that group together, we have the other four pillars, which you call salah, which does not directly translate as prayer, and which could be said individually, but encouraged to be said in community. The third one is the fast, which is an individual thing. You can decide to fast individually or not, but it is encouraged because the month of Ramadan, you'll be surprised to know, it's a very, very social month for Muslims. Extremely social, more than any other time of the year. So it's both a group activity and individual activity. Then the zakat, the fourth pillar, is the individual's responsibility to the community, in that you have to give 2.5% of your capital every year back to the community. And the fifth one, the hajj, is both an individual expression of yourself and also a manifest demonstration of community solidarity. 2 to 3 million people visit Mecca every year. You see, so for me as a Muslim, there is a very, very intrinsic connection between my individuality and my community. And in the final analysis, the community rules supreme. If you don't believe me, go and see that film 127 Hours, because this man didn't like people. And when his arm was trapped for 127 hours, you know the film I'm talking about? He said, I want people. I want people. This is the man who fell down a canyon in Arizona and was trapped for 127 hours. So we can be individuals, but we eventually dependent on community.
Aber darf ich jetzt doch noch schnell...
But may I put another question then? Make sure that I've understood you correctly. According to your interpretation, it's not really possible to live your own religion personally, individually, and have nothing to do with community. That doesn't work in your interpretation.
All right, okay. That's another matter. I was speaking as a Muslim. Now, this is interesting. This is an interesting question here. I think an individual can hold a faith. That's possible. Of course, it is. There are, as you said, there are 4 out of 5 young people in Switzerland who have a faith but are individually motivated. Then I want to ask them, how does it manifest itself? Because do you go to the top of Mont Blanc and raise your hands every morning, or do you sit quietly in a corner in your home, the bedroom in the morning, and light a candle? Or is it just about human interaction? What is it about? Is it that you think you're a good person and you want to be honest? Is that all? I don't know. So I like to ask these people. I'm not against it. That's the individual's choice. Okay. But for me as a Muslim, it's very difficult. Okay. Because I know I'm an individual. Yeah. I've lived long enough to know that, and I have my individuality. Okay. But I also know that I'm committed to a community of people. Okay. And there is an interaction. Mm-hmm. There is no conflict. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Good. Loretan?
Mr. Loretan? The fact that we have religious freedom in our nation is such that every individual decides where he and she belongs to. There's no other possibility. Freedom is guaranteed. It's a constitutionality. It's the constitutional state which permits this. And you can belong to a religious community if you want to. And this freedom is guaranteed by law. So that's why we need the church or churches, because the state dictates that religious questions, issues are not part of our authority. But then you have to put questions on how you understand Christianity, your own Christianity, and this can be discussed in the community and can be celebrated with the community. I could understand individuals who in their youth are slightly distant from such institutions may in the long term, and this was true for me as well, need a place or a community or a community where you can encounter others and tell your own stories and also listen to the age-old stories. And this recounting of stories gives me the possibility of understanding myself as an individual. So, especially in a pluralistic society with this freedom of religion, plurality ensues automatically. Where freedom of religion is inscribed in the constitution, society is automatically pluralistic, and that is why individuals have to find their own identity in a religious community. So you're saying specifically that you cannot have faith in the long term if you're not part of a community and active in a community. Well, in sociological terms, it functions, but in theological terms, no. If you take an old theologian who said a Christian is not a Christian. Do you believe in this as well, Mr. Locher? Faith which is not within a religious community cannot be faith? No, in any case, I cannot judge other person's faith. I can only explain what faith is for me, and what the previous two speakers have said is very true. How can I have faith? How can I identify my own faith if I cannot compare it with what others have in a religious community? We have a whole treasure trove of faith which has been handed down to us by tradition. I agree with you, Mr. Pult, that I have received this tradition in freedom and freely, and I now have to decide responsibly what I want to do with it. But I'm very happy to know that this institution exists, which makes it possible for me to cope with this and handle this treasure. It's a responsibility for me. And it's also a church, a religious community or institution that is not just dictating things to us, but they are provoking us and asking us to discuss these things and pass on these things. And that is where we probably have a commonality with other religious communities and faiths, that we do the same thing. I think religious institutions should make us happy, and this is not selfish. It's not for me as an individual to be selfish, happy. We need to find a way of living together which makes us satisfied and happy. And we should be happy with the creation around us. So I'm very happy to be part of a community which is much older than what I myself could cobble together. Yes, I'd like to come back to this, if I may. You are talking about happiness. You speak about happiness of the individual with the church, in the church, but quite obviously this is not true for the majority of people. I'll give you two figures in the canton of Basel. This is the first canton in Switzerland so far where more than half of its population has no religion, or states that it has no confession, no faith. And 27% of those who are in a religious community think more or less frequently about leaving their religious community. So what can churches, the religious institutions, do in order to motivate young people more and show them the way on how to become happy? Well, pluralism is a very good thing, and it's also a good thing that churches no longer have a monopoly. There should be a marketplace for different truths, and the churches have to examine whether they can pass on their truth. And we haven't succeeded in this, at least not fully. My yardstick is still to be happy. We don't always succeed in achieving this objective. Maybe it's not so black and white, and it's not true for the Swiss situation that there's so much pessimism. And I think the only thing that will help us is going to be transparency. Mrs. Parhisi? Professor Loretan, a moment ago, spoke about the positive aspects that the churches give us a framework in which we can experience my own faith. I come from a country where institutionalized faith really is a problem as far as I'm concerned. When religion is an institution, then it becomes very negative, especially if you think of all the cases of abuse last year, because then you think in terms of, oh, church, this is terrible, and all these negative aspects of religion as an institution. But there are other aspects as well. It's not so much a question for me whether faith needs religious institutions or a religious institution. This probably requires individual response. The religious institutions exist. We shouldn't give the impression of religious institutions, Christian religious institutions, having no importance simply because so many people do not belong to such institutions. They are part of culture, and I very much appreciate this kind of culture. If we want to term ourselves as secular Muslims, I'd like to tell you a personal story. When my father died a few years ago in a car accident, it was awful news that I received from Iran. So I went to Iran and then returned to Europe, and there was a moment in time where I just did not know how to cope with the grief. I spoke with a friend at university who now is a professor in Münster, who had lost both his parents to cancer. And he said to me, well, your father is in heaven and he's much happier there than here. And I asked him, well, how did you cope with the grief and the loss of your parents? He told me that the solution that he had found wouldn't work for me because I wasn't Christian, but he went to church and he looked for consolation for his grief there. And I said to him, well, why do you think that wouldn't work for me? So this is what I'd like to tell the audience here. You cannot put everything into neat categories. You have the Muslims, you have the immigrants. By coincidence, I went to a Catholic church for quite a while because a friend of mine was very active there. So I went to Catholic church several Sundays in a row, and my husband was puzzled. He said, does this really help you? And I can tell you it did help me. So for me, churches and religious institutions simply exist. So the question is rather, what can these institutions do in terms of integration in the framework of globalization? And this is really an issue which concerns us very much in Germany and in Switzerland with all the citizens' initiatives. And I feel that churches could really do very much there.
Well, obviously the institution can play a role in bringing succor to people to help them to relieve their pain. Is that interesting for you, Mr. Paul? Yes, well, I can understand that. As I say, I'm not a believer, but in the Middle East, where I've seen mosques, I've had very positive experience. The same in churches here. They're places, even if you don't believe in God, where they really can affect your mood. And if just because you don't believe doesn't mean that you don't have any sense of spirituality, but one simply doesn't subscribe to a spiritual perspective. You said something very important, Mr. Locher. Churches shouldn't have a monopoly on ethical orientation or on faith, as you said. I would go further. Religious communities can not believe that they have a monopoly on ethics. You can have a clear doctrine, if you like, very clear values, without believing in God. I would agree with Mr. Khalid that religions and communities don't have to represent God's creation on earth, that they are also part of the culture, that they carry the culture, that they are part of culture and created by culture. What's important is that as a society which requires community and identity, we don't just say, let's link all that to religion and some kind of idea of the afterlife, but rather, how do we find meaning in the earthly life now? That involves political commitment. That's a political idea, that we have this life, this society, this world, and that we can make it a better place now. So I'm a lot more likely to follow something that Stéphane Esseda said, a former French diplomat, who says that we need to promote human rights. We need to transform this world and this society as political citizens. Firstly, we have our political role, and then later we could be Christians, Muslims, Jews. That's very important for one's own private identity. But as a society, I think we need greater common cohesion and commitment here and now. Mr. Schieder, sometimes I have the impression that with people who don't have a religion, that they represent the general view, and that people who have a religion are different in some kind of way. So I think everybody is a person. They all have their beliefs, but some kind of statement of general it's not that a secular politician would have a greater claim to a view than a Christian politician, for example. Let me answer the question of what the churches have to do to attract young people. Well, first of all, I think we need to avoid any kind of alarmism. If you compare how many young people belong to a political party, in Germany it's around 2 or 3%, and that's not young people, it's people overall. How many people belong to churches? 75%, although in East Germany it's a lot lower. But in West Germany, still 80% of people are members of a church. So there's nothing extremely alarming. The worst thing that has happened is that over the past years, the churches themselves have sounded the alarm. Where is the evidence of a loss of religion and the rise of secularism? There isn't much evidence for it. There might be less attendance to church, but it might be due to a drop in quality. If no one is going to church, there is a tendency to blame the people. But in fact, it's the religious communities that are responsible. And those places where there is a high-quality church, high-quality service, there are a lot of people coming. There's a big congregation. So churches just need to get better. Well, you can. I think we have a lot of young people who want to go to church, who want to belong to a faith community. If it's fun for them, if it provides meaning, then young people have a future in the church. And I think that plurality is important. We need a free society where there's no obligation to become part of a hierarchy. But Mr. Pult, you're really generalizing when you talk about churches today. I think I can certainly speak for my own religion. We're certainly not like you've been saying. I think that we do the things that you've been talking about, and we do reach out. I don't think we want to reach out too much. We don't want to oppress people. But I do think that we can claim that we create freedom and we create quality, and the future outlook is very positive for the churches. Well, allow me to come to Mr. If I can follow what Mr. Blocher said. Mr. Blocher is a Swiss politician. Sorry, I meant Mr. Locher. I didn't mean Mr. Blocher as a joke. It's just a slip of the tongue. Quite often I go to services on a Sunday and I find it difficult to find a seat. 2 seats together. That's at 4 o'clock on a Sunday in Lucerne at the Franciscan Church. Oh, that's surprising, says the moderator. I've never experienced that. Coming to the question of whether faith needs a church, philosophically, there are traditions which say there are questions which are simply questions of knowledge. Questions that you know the answer to, that you can be certain about. But there are questions also that you can't answer, that you can never know. On the television I saw an interview of an atheist from Universität College London, and he believed that he could scientifically prove his atheism. There was a theologian from the Reformed Church who was very good, and so showed him that he had a very simple understanding of science. There are questions which cannot be scientifically proven. Does God exist? That's something that we don't know. It's something that we can only have faith in. So we find people on both sides who believe that they know. We have communities of atheists who are gaining recognition, gaining in the amount of attention that they get, and then you have the faith communities of religious communities who believe, have a transcendent belief, who believe in a God. And I think it's important to recognize that there are areas where we can only have beliefs, where we cannot have full knowledge. And once that has been recognized, then this scientific view that everything can be settled through a scientific approach is something which is naive, and even amongst scientific community it's been being shown to be naive. But there are, as Habermas said in his book, very bread and bone representatives of this approach. Now, you're saying that we have, as churches, Mr. Locher, more to offer than people know about, or people say. Now, as we've just heard, there are things that we have to believe and things that we can know. But as churches have to act as if their faith is certain. I've read an interview with you, for example, before Christmas, where you said on a number of occasions, the most important thing is that God sent his Son to us. So what do you do with a young person who comes to you and says, I can't believe in this. I cannot believe that God sent his Son to earth. What do you say to them? Well, I didn't know that the discussion would become so theological. the church has been doing the same thing for the 2,000 years with those who don't believe. I think that there is a question of why you should believe in something which transcends daily life. If the question comes to me, I would say that there has been a community of people who have heard this message over the millennia because they find it true, that it reflects something in them, and that it speaks their truth, a truth that can only be spoken in a free, pluralistic society. Everybody has their right to their own truth. Maybe the SP, Socialist Party in Graubünden, everybody has their own claim to the truth. We need to have a society which allows that. But if I, as a parson, don't recognize that the message of Jesus Christ makes people happy, then I should leave my post. Well, the question is rather, what do we do with those who cannot believe it, who don't believe it? I think there needs to be some kind of process of reaching out, of teaching about the message. We don't want to be dogmatic. There is the teaching of the Trinity in the Bible, but not only that. There are many passages in the Bible where Jesus is seen as a model. It's not, in those passages, it's not said that Jesus sits on the right hand of God. That all emerged later in the 4th century. In the dialogue with Muslims, it's an interesting question. This question of how that emerged. If we're saying that God has come to earth, then we have to say that he came as in human form to communicate love. And this human form of God makes it more plausible. If you look at the debates that have taken place between East and West churches, we see that it's a very controversial issue. And it's very difficult to understand how one can think of Jesus Christ as God. Allowing a bit more controversy, a little bit more heresy, that would do the church good. It would breathe life into it. At the moment, it's too stale. I think that religious education is very important. And it doesn't mean that there are non-believers, that we are all searchers, and we're trying to bring that search into line with the traditions. Mr. Khalid, you wanted to speak?
There are so many strands to this. I wonder where I could pick this one up. Instead of getting into deep theological waters, what I would just like to say is that in Islam, it's strictly monotheistic. It begins with the La ilaha illallah. The affirmation begins with there is no God but God. So it's a very strictly monotheistic path. And all the prophets, we profoundly believe in Christ and Moses and Abraham as prophets. And Muhammad is the final prophet. Having got that out of the way, I just want to get back as far as is possible to the hub of what we are here today about individualism and faith. I'm sure people in Switzerland will have heard of Stephen Hawking. He's the astrophysicist from Cambridge. He was exploring the universe. He was quite a famous man. You know Stephen Hawking? Yeah. He's a man who sits in this, he can't talk here. You know what he said? He said, about society today, all we have to look forward is affluence and more affluence. That's it. So I have to ask a question. All the theology aside, is that what life is about? Is that why we are here? Now, as an environmentalist, I have begun to realize that on the other side, for us to have the affluence we so deeply long for and we are hooked into, is that an utter devastation of rainforests, the utter devastation of fishing, the utter pollution of the environment, global climate change and global warming and all these kinds of things. I think in a sense, we can talk about theology and scholars and theologians have discussed all these. We can also talk about power. Power can be abused, whether it is power emanating from religion or whether it is power emanating from politics. We know about the Stalins and the Hitlers of these worlds. And we know what's happening in Islamic countries. But that does not destroy the principle. It is in the end about people. You see, and it is in the end about a struggle. You see, so on the one hand, there are people in other parts of the world, the Islamic world, in Iran perhaps, tied up with this power struggle, ostensibly based on a faith, which again, we are puzzled about this. It should be the opposite. But then people here are struggling with something quite opposite. They are struggling with these basic questions of why are young people drifting away from religious institutions. You see, and for them, you see, heaven is here today. It's here. You don't have to wait till you die. You can have your mobile phones and your Rolex oysters, and you can have you can have a good job, and that's it. You've done, finished. Mm-hmm. There's nothing. You got everything you wanted, and I think that comes from, in a way, I think the time is coming. I feel for these young people. My grandchildren are not going to see a world which people of my generation. I'm in my 70s, and there are people in their 60s and 70s here. I think, speaking for them, I think we've had the best time. We've had the best time. We've had the best time. And what we are leaving these young people who are confused and who don't know where they belong. Do they belong to a church or this or that or what? They will have completely a different lifestyle. Why? Because we created it. Because our longing for this affluence, which is good life, so-called, you see, we created it. And we are leaving them a legacy which they will have to cope with. Life will be utterly different for them. Good. You see, so in a sense, it also comes from the fact that this is more the case in urban societies. The more people are detached from the natural world, the more alienation there is. People are on Valium, are on things that, drugs that take them away from the realities of the world's biggest drug industry is the opium and the cocaine industries. And so the question is, where do we go? And this comes from, I ask people, being an ecology and environmentalist, I ask people, in your daily consciousness, do you feel that you're part of something bigger? Do you feel that there is something else? I'm not talking about the divine. Do you feel connected to the earth? Do you feel part of the wind, the sun, the trees? You see, when I die, I get buried, and the organic matter I leave behind is absorbed by the trees. And the trees then produce chlorophyll. It locks carbon dioxide. I become part of the cosmos. Is this part of your consciousness? What I'm saying is, for me, my faith leads me to this consciousness. I'm saying to you, if you lose that faith, you will lose that consciousness. You can have your individuality, you see. So this is in fact a challenge to you. Where is that consciousness? If that consciousness is not there, then you become alienated from the natural world, which we are locked into, intrinsically a part of.
Herzlichen Dank. Herr Loretan, Sie wollten.
Thank you, Mr. Loretan. You also wanted to say something. I'd like to come back to a question which was raised by Mr. Locher when he spoke about happiness. I read an article written by him and came across this term again. Next Sunday, we will be talking about this in my community. Happy will be those who will thirst for truth and freedom. And that's really part of what the WEF is doing here. If those will be happy who will not have the best and the most beautiful car, but those who thirst for freedom and justice, according to Matthew, those are the ones who are going to be happy. It's really a bit absurd, because those who have no food and those who have nothing to drink cannot be happy. That is the Sermon of the Mount. Makarios, as you know, means happy. If we were to take Matthew seriously, then it would mean to say that all those who have food and drink, and I assume everyone here is in this situation, you will only be happy when all those who do not have what you have are brought to a situation in which you are, if you help them. So this institutionalized religion, my own kind of religion, has to meet this challenge. I believe that those who are thirsty for justice is a response to the World Economic Forum. One of the Chinese representatives, in fact, said that justice is going to be one of the major challenges of the future. Yes, may I come back to that? It's an interesting concept, those who thirst for justice and hunger for justice. But do religious institutions actually, are they aware of this hunger and this thirst? Are they doing something about this? And what responsibilities, what social and political responsibilities do these institutions have? Mrs. Parhisi, what should these churches and institutions do more to do justice to their own social and political responsibility, so that this hungering and thirsting for justice is actually met? Well, I was already thinking that women were not supposed to speak here, or were not going to be given the floor. No, that was a joke. I was very happy and surprised that the supreme representative of the Protestant church was saying that this evening was becoming so very theological, and you can understand very well that I cannot really respond to all such theological questions. But to come back what was said during the introduction, that 4 out of 5 young Swiss feel that they are religious, but don't feel that they are part or reject being part of a church or a religious community or institution. I think these institutions are very much based in Christian belief or religions. I'm talking about my experience in Germany. Many of the believing Muslims in Germany don't have this possibility of institution, and they would very much like to have such institutions because they are very faithful. They have great faith. But I'd like to also contribute something else to the discussion. Obviously, I cannot give you any advice on how to attract more faithful to the churches. Wherever I've been to church, I felt that it was quite full. But let me come back to that other question. What responsibilities religious institutions have besides dealing with issues of faith? I, for my part, think that the religious institutions should be responsible for faith and for the passing on of this message, but also responsible for ethical issues and issues concerning justice. On my way to Davos, I picked up some documents from a Protestant church in Frankfurt, and these brochures stated that such a large majority of the population come from migrant circles, so the religious institutions feel that so many of their target customers supposedly have a different faith. They need to rethink their responsibility. So as a non-Christian, religious institutions have a responsibility of not only divulging and disseminating a message, but that these institutions, because of the shrinking numbers of faithful, should start discussions about other issues, not just Christian faith. But every institution has to take its own decision. So these religious institutions have to deal more with social aspects and to do this in a responsible way. That, I think, is a very important task for the religious institutions. May I put another question to you then? What exactly are you wishing for? You are responsible for integration in your job. What do you see that, what would you like the churches in Germany to do specifically? Well, before I answer that specifically, as an expert in constitutional matters, one has to remember that religious freedom also has a negative aspect. Regardless from where you come, the negative aspects of religious freedom are being underlined. So religious freedom has these positive and negative aspects, and they have equal importance. What I would like religious institutions to do more about is to promote equality. Many of you here this evening have stated that you feel part of a religious community. I feel that I'm part of a group that is being discriminated, or not enough importance is given to us. Everyone focuses on the dangerous sides of Islam and forgets about the others who perhaps do not identify so much with Islam and have a hybrid identity. I spoke about the cultural values as well. We don't want to be bound to a specific religious institution. In Germany, this is quite easy. In France, it's less easy. But I think that the religious institutions should assume greater responsibility and to do this in cooperation. A proposal was made in Frankfurt for churches to look for partners so that they can help those who are in distress. There's no way the institutions, the religious institutions, can work in splendid isolation. They have to cooperate with each other. If a religious institution would like to set up a shelter for those who are persecuted in any way, need partners to achieve this. Just imagine that Muslims who are being looked at with suspicion were to suggest setting up some kind of shelter which normally would be under the authority of a Christian religious institution. That would be unmanageable. But we would like to be treated equally, not because we are so deeply religious, but simply because we are loyal citizens and we deserve equal treatment. Many people I know are in favor of religion, Islamic religion being taught at schools, and they are in favor for reasons of equal treatment. We live in Germany. We want to have the same rights and duties as all other citizens. And here, the religious institutions, churches, could, hand in hand with the government, with the state, help us.
Well, okay, well, there's definitely a wish expressed for more equality of opportunity. So, we've got till 8:30. Does that mean I have to go to the floor now? Otherwise I'll get a telling off. Okay. Okay, so it's your turn, dear guests. The floor is open. A young man at the front.
Hello? Okay. My name is Sidi Amipa. I'd like to ask Mr. Khalid a question. Mrs. Parhisi stated that she believes that an institutionalized church is problematic in terms of freedom, individual freedom. And Mr. Khalid, you come from a country where one church plays a major role in public life or in the state. And there are senior bishops are members of the House of Lords. The head of state is also head of one church, and the crown prince and crown princess are not allowed to marry Catholics. So, Mr. Khalid, you as a representative of a religious minority, you think that an institutionalized church is problematic? Because I don't think so. Because I believe Britain is quite tolerant country compared to many other European countries. So,
okay, it's a very interesting question to ask me as a UK citizen. Yeah, but I mean, I can answer the question by saying I wish more people in Britain went to church. I hope church numbers increase, and I wish there were more believers, regardless of their faith. I have nothing to do with the House of Lords or royalty. That's politics. And my role as a British citizen is to function within the law and practice my faith. And we have freedoms there to do it. And we get on well with the other religious institutions and a lot of dialogue and interfaith activity. And that's the way it should be. I don't have any problems. And I think the church as an institution, especially in European countries, has been losing ground in the last century. Although it is in the latest statistic that 67% of the British people are believers, but only about 20% go to church. And otherwise they use it for births, marriages and deaths, as many Christians do, a manifestation of their faith. But my basic answer to you is I wish more people went to church.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Weitere Fragen?
Any further questions? Yes, the gentleman here. The microphone is on the way.
My name is
Hans Pestalozzi. I have a few comments and questions. The institutionalization of a faith is always wrong. Why? Yes, well, I said I have comments and questions. So I want to be careful, because we know what has happened as a result of institutionalization of faith, initially Christianity with the Spanish Inquisition and what have you. It is the individual decision to decide what to believe, and not that of an institution. And that is why I, as an individual, have the opportunity to study the scriptures and to other sacred books as well, and not to have to be told what to think. I'm fully in favor of a community, but not the institutionalization of faith. Mr. Locher, you said that religious freedom is part of the constitution in Switzerland, and because of that, it is limited if it comes to violating the constitution, such as Sharia law. It's right, as you said, Mr. Pult, that the Enlightenment has helped us to find human rights, but do not forget that they come from Christianity, because all other cultures, and I know them very well because I have lived everywhere in the world, they find human rights and democracy a new form of colonialization of their countries. Don't forget that. Behind every culture is the religion and its values, and the values and the religion are not the result of the culture. Those were the questions and comments that arose as I listened to what was being said, because it's always assumed that humanism takes priority over religion, over faith, and perhaps over the individual person. Well, allow me to say, in response to what you said about institutions and the dangers of institutionalization of faith. In early Christianity, institutions arose because bishops had such an important social function, received such huge revenues, it was necessary to have some kind of structure to control it all, and clearly defined roles for people, and therefore a framework for the church's work in the community. So that was one reason for building institutions. But you're right about one thing. The church and the institutions need to constantly put themselves into question. The prophets criticized the God that was believed in by the people with very severe language. They didn't beat around the bush. They said that they used words such as whores. They used many very strong language to deliver their criticism of the institutions. I've written a book about religion in the context of human rights, where I discussed this question of criticism of religion, saying that religion isn't something which is inherently exclusively good. It brings values to society, but it can also be very dangerous. And I'm not talking about other religions, I'm talking about my own religion. And therefore, I think that we need to hold up human rights as a test for religions, and I think that it's necessary for religious communities, in the plural, to ask these questions and integrate human rights into their way of seeing, not just by judging what's happening in the world beyond their door, but also to ask themselves questions. Obviously, within an institution, there are individuals who make mistakes, who take the wrong path, but private institutions, as we've heard in these discussions at the Open Forum, make huge institutional mistakes, such as corruption, amongst others, and these have to be worked on so that members of institutions are protected from their own organization. So I would ask that this perpetual self-criticism take place in institutions. Yes, Mr. Pult, would you have anything to add? Well, I would have to disagree strongly with something that you said. I agree with some of the things you did say, but I would disagree when you say that human rights are Christian, full stop, and they're not, and they are perceived as new colonialism in non-Christian regions, is extremely hazardous. Extremely hazardous view for the development of our world. Why? And I'll answer. obviously there is a discussion, both an academic and grassroots discussion, which discusses what the origins of human rights are, to what extent are they influenced by the West, by the Enlightenment, by religion, by other religious communities, etc. That's an ongoing discussion, and only a small minority would say that human rights are not universal. Human rights are universal. One clear sign of that is that they stand in the UN Human Rights Charter, which is perhaps the most important document that humanity drafted in the 20th century. It actually laid down a specific definition of what human rights are, and it's very dangerous to follow the line of argument that you're following. If you look at Egypt, and I was in Egypt this week. I admit I wasn't there because of the political situation. I had a holiday planned by the Red Sea, so I was satisfying my own materialistic needs. But while I was there, I had discussions with many young Egyptians, and it was fascinating. It was really emotionally moving to speak with these people. Coptic Christians, Muslims. If you say to them, human rights are a form of Christian or Western colonization, they will find that ridiculous, because they are putting their lives at stake for human rights. The human rights, universal human rights, are the greatest achievement of the 20th century. They can be further developed. The improvements can be made, but to just dismiss them in their totality is extremely dangerous, because it is the foundation of peace in the world and in our societies. Can I make a comment on that as well? Well, I would ask us to keep the answers as short as possible, so somebody else can ask their questions. Yes, very briefly to the comment that was made. It's said in some countries that you're saying that there is this neo-colonialism. I have looked into this. I've done research on it. And I was responsible for education in Afghanistan, or I've worked in this area. Now that's the orthodox view, where young people die for human rights. Don't forget the Green Wave in Iran, for example. I don't think that they believe that human rights come from the West. It's part of being human. Christians can't claim human rights for themselves, negatively or positively. I just wanted to say that.
Okay, one short answer.
Yes, short one. There is ample anthropological human rights and egalitarian societies existed long before Western democracies evolved.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Gut. Weitere Fragen?
Other questions?
Herrn vor der Kamera dort, ja.
Gentleman in the orange sweater. I just want to make a comment to what Mr. Pestalozzi has said. I don't know what religion he has. Christian faith doesn't have any holy scriptures. The Christian faith is an oral transmission that is based on the word, the spoken word. And the churches are based on communities that tell stories. And we feel, or we are talking as if institutions were something forced, an obligation. We, as followers of God, and as Christians and Muslims, understand religious institution as an organization with which we just have to live. That may be the key to understanding what are we talking about when we're calling the church a religious institution. It's not just a man-made institution that we want to anchor. It's a place where we can tell stories and convey a message, as Mr. Loretan has described, that we pass on this faith to others. It is institutionalized, and we want to maintain this movement. It should stay alive. And in fact, we're talking about a person. When we speak about the church, we talk about the founder of the church, of the religion. It's not something that has been cobbled together and then will exist forever and for all eternity. A French sociologist, Luc Voitansky, gave a definition of institution. He says that institutions, in contrast to human beings, have no body, and that is why institutions live longer than human beings. So institutions have the great advantage of being able to incorporate new generations and therefore survive longer than one generation. It's interesting to hear Mr. Khalid saying that there are 5 pillars, that these 5 pillars are certain practices, certain activities that are passed on from a generation to the next. And since they can become independent, they have to be questioned as well. But religious institutions have to be free institutions. It may be a paradox, but that's the only way it could function. That is the key word. What exactly is an institution? Kant said that institution and freedom are not opposites. On the contrary, when freedom is to be organized, then there's no need for institution. If you want to play fairly at football, you need certain rules, and someone has to see that the rules of the game are observed, and there you have an institution. So freedom and institution were seen for a very long time as being opposites. In legal terms, of course, the right to freedom, basic and human rights of the individual, can only be guaranteed through an institution, and that's true also for religion. I'm not here speaking about a religious institution, but religion could also be a clerical theocracy, and that's a different model of religion and exists as well. But I'm pleading in favor of religion as an institution that is free, an institution of freedom. And if that is so, then the basic human rights must be enshrined and guaranteed legally in and within this institution. So we're back to the institution. The criticism of institutions has to be taken seriously, and we know very well that other institutions like the state also have to deal with this issue of power, and religious institutions have to raise this issue of how to deal with power. You said in an interview, Mr. Loretan, that the future of the Catholic Church is in the hands of women. Do you believe really that power is not distributed evenly and that this goes against basic human rights? Yes, that is what I have said written in certain articles. It's a fact that those who study theology are mainly women. At my faculty, the Faculty of Theology in Lucerne, 45% of the faculty are women. So there is a change that is happening. And mostly it'll be women who will be leading communities, will be priests and parsons. That is a definite trend. Until the beginning of the 20th century, it was quite obvious that only men would be leaders of religious communities. Gertrude Heinzelmann, who is a proponent of women's rights, has been able to counter this argument on the basis of Thomas of Aquinas's tenets. So there are new arguments that have had to be sought to allow women in. And because it was not so acceptable, the response was simply to say you cannot talk about it anymore, which was already a capitulation. It's not really a question, just a kind of a comment. You've had a very abstract discussion on the meaning of religious institutions. Of course, it's an important question, but from my point of view, I'd like to say something and then put a question. I have been a parson for about 22 years in the Bernese Oberland in Spitz, and I have my personal experience of what a church is and what it has to be done, what the church has to do. I get telephone calls at 12 o'clock at night. I have to deal with young people who have debts. We look after old people and others, needy people in their homes. And the sermon is really only a tiny part of my work. So my question is, I've just given you a brief description of my activities. I could speak endlessly about the activities that a parson has and that should be the responsibility of a church. Is there any way you can reconcile what I have described to you as our active work with your theoretical ideas and doctrines? Yes, indeed, because it is not a contrast with the message. There is the institution that has a message, and that message has to be put into practice by individuals. And if we want to practice this seriously, then the experience that you've had in your community, where you've been able to give happiness to individuals, is something that can help these individuals to be part of a community. I think that a majority of the population in our country knows this. This study of the National Fund proves this. A lot is achieved that is duly appreciated by those who have the beneficiaries of these services. I'd like to take this input from you as a subject of the last round of discussion. If we thought a little more about these activities that you described, then I think there would be less suspicion vis-à-vis of the churches. So could you describe very briefly what commitment would you like religious institutions to make and to assume, and a kind of commitment that would attract more people to religious communities? For decades, I'd say that the state assumed a lot of the responsibility that was borne by the church in the past. Now, of course, we know that the social welfare state has to downsize because it's simply not possible to continue in this way. And I think it is the religious institutions that are very well positioned to take over from the welfare state. And therefore, they have to be seen and understand themselves as actors in society. Mr. Pult? Well, first of all, I would like to thank you, all of you who are so committed to society. And secondly, I do not quite agree that organized social justice can no longer be financed. That is just a dogmatic statement. Society is extremely rich, as never before, but there's an inequality in the distribution of wealth. Now, whether you're an active member of a religious institution or community or not, there are all sorts of reasons for which you can try and improve society, moved by whichever reason. So whether a religious community is institutionalized or whether it is free, I think one should be committed, not because you hope that you will find a better world after death, but try and improve life here on earth. And I think in this case, faith is very liberating and a good thing. Mr. Locher, a very brief statement. I would like to see a religious institution that opens the path to heaven and to have a community that helps all of us, that gives us support during our life and when we die. Mr. Loretan, what do you see by way of support from the religious institutions? Well, I feel that in the year of volunteering, I would like to see churches recognize this more, and also that this work be appreciated. All this could not be financed. Many people say that they do not agree with this faith, but they are willing to help whenever there is social aid to be given to street people, for example. Obviously, the religious communities need to continue and survive, but maybe they have to be transformed into something new. Mrs. Parhisi? I just hope that the Republican values, such as human basic rights, are taken as a foundation, as a fundamental right, and that the state guarantee these rights for people, whether they are of Christian or Muslim belief, and ensure that all citizens get equal treatment. Mr. Khalid, what do you see the religious institutions to do more?
For me, it's not a problem. Without institutions, there'll be no civilization. It's a priori, it's essential. Civilization progress, whether it's religious or non-religious, institutions are essential. But how we deal with that is an important question. But I'd like to, on a point of information, especially as far as Sunni Islam is concerned, one could almost say that there are no institutions because there is no priesthood or hierarchy in Sunni Islam, and there is also no chain of mosques. Each mosque is independent. So in that sense, the approach is very community oriented, and you can call that an institution if you want. If some people gather together and express their views in terms of a set of rules, then it becomes an institution. So a priori, it is important, and we must have it.
Thank you very much.
Inevitable.
Thank you very much. Herzlichen Dank an alle hier auf.
Well, thank you very much to all the panelists, and thank you to you, the audience. Thank you for your attention.